Before we begin, if you enjoy tales that drag you into the strange, forgotten corners of history with a mix of dry humor and unsettling truths, consider subscribing to Nightfall Notions. Tonight's story is not one of grandeur or glory, but of the man who stood, or rather tumbled, at the bottom of the royal food chain. The Fool. Chapter 1. The Crown's Court Jester, a laughing matter. In the grand halls of medieval Europe, where kings and queens held court with all the solemnity of a funeral procession, there was one figure who defied the gravity of it all: the royal fool. Clad in motley, bells jingling with every unsteady step, he was the living, breathing punchline to the monarchy's endless joke. But behind the laughter, the role of the fool was a paradox, a man both cherished and expendable, revered and reviled, the only person in the room allowed to speak truth to power, so long as he made it funny. The origins of the royal fool stretch back further than most realize. Ancient Rome had its Morionazes, dim-witted slaves paraded for amusement. The Byzantine emperors kept Isalos, holy fools who couched divine wisdom in nonsense. But it was in the courts of medieval Europe that the fool truly found his niche, or rather, his noose. Officially, his job was simple: entertain. But unofficially, he was the court's pressure valve, the one who could mock the king's bad haircut or the queen's disastrous foreign policy without losing his head. At least, in theory. Take, for instance, the case of Roland the Unfortunate, Jester to King Henry VIII. Roland had a gift for mimicry, and one evening, after one too many goblets of wine, he decided to impersonate the king's famously short temper. He stomped around the hall, bellowing about beheading cooks for undercooked pheasant, and sentencing his own shadow to the tower for treason. The court roared with laughter, until the king did not. Roland's career ended abruptly, much like his neck. But not all fools met such grim fates. Some, like Will Sommers, Henry VIII's lover Jester, wielded their wit like a surgeon's scalpel. Will once quipped that the king's newest wife, Anne of Cleves, resembled a Flemish mare. The insult should have been fatal, but Henry, perhaps because he privately agreed, only laughed. Will survived, proving that the fool's greatest skill wasn't humor, but knowing exactly how far to push before the laughter turned lethal. The fool's importance was as much about psychology as entertainment. In a world where everyone bowed, the fool's irreverence was a twisted form of honesty. Kings, surrounded by sycophants, needed someone to remind them they were human, or at least to let the court eye pretending they wanted reminding. The fool's antics were a carefully staged rebellion, a way to vent frustrations without actual treason. After all, what's the point of absolute power if you can't laugh at yourself? But the fool's safety was always conditional. His license to mock came stamped with an invisible expiration date. One day, his jokes were tolerated. The next, they were treason. The line between amusing and off with his head was as thin as a dagger's edge. And so the fool danced on that edge, bells jingling, knowing that the moment the laughter stopped, so would he. The royal fool was, in many ways, the most honest job in the court. He was paid to be ridiculous, but his existence exposed the ridiculousness of power itself. And that, perhaps, was why his job was so often a dead end. Literally. Chapter 2. The Fine Line Between Wit and Treason. To be a royal fool was to live in a world where every joke was a gamble. One moment a well-timed quip about the king's thinning hairline could earn you a purse of gold. The next, a poorly phrased jest about his latest military blunder could earn you a date with the executioner. The fool's survival depended on an unspoken rule: make them laugh, but never let them think. And yet, the best fools did both, knowing full well that brilliance was often punished more harshly than stupidity. Consider the case of Triboulet, the infamous jester of King Francis. I of France. Triboulet was no mere buffoon. He was sharp-tongued and unafraid, a man who understood that the most dangerous truths could be smuggled inside a laugh. Once when the king complained about the stench of the court, Triboulet quipped, "Perhaps your majesty should look under his own throne." The court gasped. The king, after a tense silence, burst into laughter. It was a risky move, a direct jab at royal hypocrisy. But Triboulet had judged his audience perfectly. Not all were so lucky. In the court of Ivan the Terrible, jesters didn't just risk metaphorical knives in the back. They risked real ones. Ivan kept a jester named Mishka, a hulking brute with a talent for crude slapstick. Mishka's act involved tripping over his own feet, spilling wine on nobles, and pretending to misunderstand orders in ways that humiliated the court's most pompous members. For a time, Ivan adored him. Then one frozen winter night, Mishka made the fatal mistake of joking about the Tsar's latest massacre. "At this rate," he slurred, "we'll run out of boyars before we run out of snow." Ivan, who had laughed at far crueler jests, suddenly didn't. Mishka was impaled on a spike before dawn. The fool's precarious existence was shaped by the whims of his master. A king in a generous mood might reward a barbed joke with land or titles. The same king, in a black temper, might decide that the joke had been treason all along. The line wasn't just thin. It moved without warning. Some jesters tried to hedge their bets by playing the simpleton, leaning into stupidity so blatant that no one could accuse them of subtext. Others, like Jane Fool, the rare female fool in Henry VIII's court, used their marginal status to their advantage. Jane, who played the role of the natural fool, a person believed to be genuinely dim-witted, could get away with remarks that would have gotten a sharper tongue flayed alive. When she once asked the king why he kept marrying women who ended up shorter, the court tittered nervously. Henry, perhaps amused by the idea that Jane didn't understand her own joke, let it slide. The most successful fools mastered the art of plausible deniability. A jest about the king's resemblance to a bloated pig could be passed off as innocent, so long as the fool widened his eyes and stammered, "Oh, but pigs are noble creatures, your majesty." The trick was to ensure that the insult was obvious enough to delight the court, but vague enough to evade punishment. It was a verbal high-wire act, performed without a net. Yet for all its dangers, the role of the fool was oddly privileged. In a world where speaking out of turn could mean death, the fool was the only one permitted to say the unsayable. He could mock war, taxes, even royal adultery, so long as he made it funny. His humor was a pressure valve, a way for the court to release tensions that might otherwise boil over into actual rebellion. The fool's job wasn't just to entertain. It was to remind everyone, king included, that power was absurd. That absurdity was the fool's shield, but it was also his curse. Because when the laughter stopped, so did his protection. And in the end, even the cleverest fool was just a bad day away from becoming a cautionary tale. Chapter 3. Fools by Appointment. The Hiring Process. The selection of a royal fool was never as simple as picking the funniest man in the tavern. Kings and queens did not suffer incompetence lightly, not even in their jesters. A fool had to be more than amusing. He had to survive. And so the hiring process for this most peculiar of court positions was a meticulous, often ruthless affair, where the wrong joke could end a candidacy before it began, and the right one could secure a lifetime of precarious employment. Some fools were born into the role. The so-called natural fools, those deemed simple-minded or physically unusual, were often plucked from obscurity and installed at court as living curiosities. Their very existence was entertainment. Their stumbles, lisped words, and childlike misunderstandings were gold to nobles desperate for distraction. But these naturals were exceptions. Most fools were professionals, sharp-witted performers who had honed their craft in market squares and traveling troupes before auditioning for the highest-paying gig in the land. Take, for example, the case of Chicot, the legendary jester of King Henry III of France. Chicot was no bumbling half-wit. He was a former soldier, a master of swordsmanship, and a man whose wit could flay a duke at 30 paces. When Henry's agents first scouted him, they didn't just test his jokes. They tested his nerve. A would-be fool had to hold his own in a room full of armed, drunk, and easily offended nobles. One misstep could mean a beating, or worse. Chico passed by delivering a scathing mock eulogy for a famously corrupt bishop, then dodging the man's henchmen with such agility that the king was sold on the spot. Training, if it could be called that, was brutal and informal. New fools learned by watching, by surviving, by figuring out which courtiers were safe to mock, and which would stab you in your sleep. Some monarchs preferred their jesters to have other skills, singing, juggling, even acrobatics, to pad out the hours between insults. A fool who could tumble while reciting a dirty limerick about the Queen's favorite advisor was worth his weight in gold. But the most critical quality in a fool was his ability to read the room. The same joke that had a king howling with laughter on Tuesday might send him into a rage on Wednesday. A wise fool kept a mental ledger of grudges, alliances, and scandals, adjusting his act accordingly. He knew when to flatter, when to provoke, and, crucially, when to feign stupidity to avoid suspicion. The best fools were like courtly seismographs, detecting the faintest tremors of royal displeasure before the earthquake hit. Disposability was baked into the role from the start. Contracts, if they existed at all, were verbal and revocable on a whim. A jester who fell out of favor wasn't fired, he was forgotten, or worse. Some were demoted to stable hands. Others vanished into dungeons. A lucky few were pensioned off with a modest purse and a warning to never speak of their time at court. Yet for all the risks, competition for the position was fierce. The perks were undeniable: fine clothes, regular meals, and a front-row seat to history. A talented fool might even gain a measure of influence, whispering advice in the guise of nonsense, playing the long game like any other courtier. The difference was that while other advisors schemed in shadows, the fool did his work in the open, hiding truth in laughter, and hoping, every day, that the laughter wouldn't stop. Chapter 4. The Dark Humor of the Plague Years. There had always been an unspoken rule among jesters. When the world burns, you make people laugh at the smoke. But when the Black Death slithered through Europe, leaving streets piled with corpses and the air thick with the scent of decay, even the most hardened fools found their tongues growing heavy. Comedy in the shadow of the plague was like dancing on a bed of hot coals. Possible, if you moved fast enough, but likely to leave you screaming. The first signs were subtle. A jester might notice the nobles clutching pomanders of herbs to their noses a little tighter, or the way servants disappeared overnight without explanation. Then came the boarded-up houses, the distant tolling of funeral bells, the physicians in their ghastly beaked masks that made them look like harbingers of doom rather than healers. The court grew thinner as lords fled to their country estates, leaving behind only the desperate, the reckless, and those with nowhere else to go, including, invariably, the fool. For the jester who remained, survival became a daily tightrope walk between distraction and disaster. The old staples, jokes about cuckoldry, drunkenness, or the king's war debts, suddenly fell flat. No one wanted to laugh at petty scandals when whole villages were being wiped out. So the fools adapted. They joked about the absurdity of it all. The charlatans selling miracle cures made of crushed emeralds and pigeon bile. The wealthy who thought they could outrun death by locking themselves in towers. The priests who insisted the plague was God's wrath, but still charged fees for last rites. One such fool, a wiry Italian named Beppo, became infamous for his plague sermon, a biting parody of the fire and brimstone preachers who roamed the street. Draped in a tattered choir robe, he would wag a sausage like a censer and bellow, "Repent, sinners!" Or at least die quietly so the gravediggers can keep up. The first time he performed it, the Duke's court had gone silent. Then, to everyone's shock, including Beppo's, the Duke had laughed until he cried. Gallows humor, it seemed, was the last refuge of the doomed. But not every ruler had such macabre tastes. In Avignon, a jester named Pippin made the mistake of quipping that Pope Clement V's lavish spending on relics wouldn't save him from the great equalizer. The remark earned him a night in the stocks, and a warning that the next joke at the church's expense would earn him a one-way trip to the mass graves. Pippin lasted another month before a poorly timed jest about the cardinal's mistress coughing suspiciously saw him thrown into quarantine, conveniently ensuring he'd never embarrass the clergy again. The plague reshaped humor itself. Old slapstick routines about pratfalls and drunken mishaps gave way to darker fare. Fools staged mock funerals for nobles who hadn't died yet, complete with exaggerated weeping and eulogies praising the deceased's remarkable ability to avoid taxes longer than the plague. They donned skeletal masks and performed morose dances, mocking the ever-present specter of death. Some even turned their satire inward, joking about their own expendability. "Worry not, my lord," one jester was said to have quipped. "If I drop dead, you can always find another fool. But who will find you another king?" Yet for all their irreverence, the jesters walked a finer line than ever. Laughter was a fragile shield against despair, and a joke that cut too close to the bone could turn a crowd from grateful to murderous in seconds. The fools who survived were the ones who knew when to push and when to retreat, when to mock the plague's horrors and when to let silence speak for itself. By the time the worst of the pestilence had passed, the survivors, both fools and nobles alike, bore the scars of those years in their hollowed cheeks and wary eyes. The jesters who remained had learned a hard lesson. Humor could keep death at bay, but only for a moment. And when the moment passed, even the loudest laugh couldn't drown out the silence that followed. Chapter 5. Satire in Silk. The costume of the condemned. The jester's motley was more than just clothing. It was a carefully constructed paradox, a wearable contradiction stitched together in bright silks and jingling bells. At first glance it appeared ridiculous. Mismatched patches, exaggerated sleeves, a floppy hat dangling with baubles like some deranged fruit tree. But every element was deliberate, from the garish colors to the ceaseless chime of bells, announcing his every move. The costume was both armor and target, a visual shorthand that simultaneously elevated the fool above ordinary men and marked him as something less than human. The origins of the motley were intentionally obscure. Some claim the patchwork symbolized the fool's fractured mind, stitched together from the scraps of sanity he no longer possessed. Others whispered it represented the broken promises of kings. Each mismatched square a failed oath, hidden in plain sight. Whatever the truth, the effect was unmistakable. When a jester entered a room, eyes followed. The costume announced his presence before he spoke a word, declaring him both entertainer and outsider, the one man in court who could be seen but never truly belonged. The bells were perhaps the most ingenious touch. Sewn onto sleeves, hats, and shoes, they jangled with every gesture, turning the fool's body into a living instrument of mockery. The sound served multiple purposes. It announced his approach, giving nobles time to steel themselves for whatever barb might come. It punctuated his jokes like a deranged percussion section. Even when standing still, the faintest tremor of his hands produced a tinkling chorus, as if his very existence was a punchline waiting to happen. But the costume's true power lay in its permission. The motley was a license to transgress, a visual cue that whatever emerged from the jester's mouth was not to be taken seriously. When a noble insulted his king, it was treason. When a jester did the same, it was comedy. The distinction lay in the fabric draped over his shoulders. The same outfit that made him ridiculous also made him untouchable, to a point. That point was tested daily. In the court of Charles VI of France, a jester named Huguet wore a particularly elaborate costume, featuring a miniature gallows sewn onto one sleeve and a grinning death's head on the other. It was a bold choice, especially for a king prone to bouts of madness. But Huguet understood the rules. The more outlandish the costume, the clearer the message that its wearer was playing a role. When he mocked the king's erratic decrees, he did so while plucking at his death's head emblem, as if to remind Charles that the joke was on everyone. It worked, until one day it didn't. Historians disagree on what finally crossed the line, but the result was unanimous. Huguet's costume was stripped from him and burned, and the man himself vanished into the bowels of the Châtelet. For female jesters, the costume was doubly fraught. Women like Jane Fool and Mathurine de Valois had to navigate not just the dangers of their profession, but the expectations of their gender. Their motley often incorporated elements of traditional female dress, longer skirts, tighter bodices, but subverted them with the same garish colors and absurd accessories as their male counterparts. The effect was unsettling to audiences. A woman who dressed like a fool was already breaking convention, and one who then used that freedom to mock her betters was doubly transgressive. Mathurine, who served multiple French kings, took this a step further by sometimes appearing in partial armor, her fool's cap perched absurdly atop a helmet. The message was clear. She was playing the game, but on her own terms. Yet for all its strategic brilliance, the motley was also a trap. By donning it, the fool accepted his role as courtly scapegoat. The same bells that announced his presence also marked him as expendable. When times grew tense, when a king needed to vent his rage without targeting a true threat, the jester's costume made him the perfect victim. After all, who would miss a man who dressed like a clown? The greatest jesters understood this. They knew their costumes were both shield and bullseye, that every jingling step they took was a gamble. And so they played the role to the hilt, leaning into the absurdity. Because the moment they stopped, the moment the laughter died, the motley became just another shroud. Chapter 6. The King's Mirror. Truth-telling and consequences. The court jester's most dangerous privilege was not the right to mock, but the right to be heard. Kings surrounded themselves with flatterers who polished lies until they gleamed like gold, but the fool was expected, occasionally, to hold up a mirror. Of course, mirrors could shatter, and when they did, the shards cut deep. History remembers the brave few jesters who dared speak truth to power, though it often remembers them as cautionary tales. In the court of King Philip VI of France, a jester named Jacquemin was said to have interrupted a war council with a simple question. Why march thousands of men into English arrows when you could just pay them to go home? The general scowled, but Philip, to his credit, paused. Jacquemin survived the encounter, though he was conspicuously absent from future strategy meetings. The trick lay in packaging wisdom as folly. A direct accusation of incompetence would get a man hanged, but the same point wrapped in absurdity might slip through. When Emperor Nero fiddled while Rome burned, his jester reportedly handed him a lyre and said, "Play us a funeral march. You've already written the guest list." The court held its breath. Nero laughed. Whether he missed the critique or simply chose to ignore it, history does not say. Some monarchs cultivated reputations for tolerating their fools' honesty. Queen Christina of Sweden kept a dwarf jester named Anders, who regularly criticized her policies. When she once asked why the people grumbled about new taxes, Anders replied, "For the same reason dogs howl when you step on their tails. It hurts." Christina, to her credit, reduced the levy. Such enlightened rulers were rare, and wise jesters knew better than to push their luck. The line between truth-teller and traitor often came down to delivery. In 1523, King Henry VIII's jester Will Somers watched the monarch pace furiously after Parliament resisted his demands. "Perhaps your Majesty should send the fools to govern," Will mused. "At least we know we're fools." Henry's initial glare softened into laughter, but the episode reveals the tightrope walk. The jester had to make the king laugh at himself without ever letting him feel truly mocked. A darker pattern emerges when examining what happened to jesters who abandoned subtlety The court of Tsar Peter the Great provides a chilling example. His jester, a sharp-tongued Italian named Jacopo, grew increasingly bold in pointing out Peter's drinking and violent outbursts. At first the Tsar tolerated these remarks, even rewarding Jacopo's honesty. But when the jester publicly compared Peter's court to a drunken bear pit, the ruler's patience snapped. Jacopo's tongue was cut out, and he spent his remaining years as a mute ornament at court, a living warning about the limits of truth-telling. The most successful truth-telling fools operated like master diplomats. They couched criticism in allegory, using animal fables or exaggerated pantomimes to make their points. At the Polish court, a jester upset about noble privilege once staged a mock feast where dogs sat at the table, while beggars gnawed bones on the floor. The message landed without a single treasonous word being spoken. Yet even the most skilled practitioners of this art understood their immunity was temporary. A jester might survive 100 cutting remarks, but the 101st could be his last. The wise ones kept escape routes handy, whether in the form of wealthy patrons, hidden savings, or, in at least 3 documented cases, secret alliances with foreign powers willing to offer asylum to particularly useful truth-tellers. Perhaps the cruelest irony was that the most effective jesters' truths were often the ones that changed nothing. Kings might laugh, nod, even praise the insight, then continue exactly as before. The fool's role wasn't to reform the system, but to let the system pretend, if only for a moment, that it could tolerate reform. This bitter truth was one no jester ever spoke aloud, that in the end the king's mirror showed only what the king wished to see. Chapter 7. Fool's Gold. The economics of entertainment. The court jester occupied a peculiar space in the medieval economy, both priceless and expendable, richly rewarded yet fundamentally powerless. His wages might dwarf those of skilled craftsmen. His wardrobe outshine minor nobility, yet at any moment his entire fortune could vanish with a royal whim. The fool's prosperity was as illusory as his motley, a gilded cage where financial security and mortal danger danced uncomfortably close. Payment structures revealed much about a jester's perceived value. Most received a combination of annual salary, performance bonuses, and valuable gifts, the latter often functioning as life insurance. When King John of England granted his fool a parcel of land for a particularly biting satire about royal taxation, the message was clear. This reward could be revoked as easily as it was given. Some jesters negotiated shockingly modern contracts. Philippe the Droll's 1392 agreement with the Duke of Burgundy specified not just his salary of 20 livres per year, but also clothing allowances, housing, and most revealingly, a clause guaranteeing his safety so long as his jests remain within the bounds of propriety. The vagueness of that final condition kept Philippe sharp. The most successful fools amassed surprising wealth. Triboulet, Francis Ives, legendary jester, died owning multiple properties in Paris. Will Sommers had enough influence to secure pensions for fellow entertainers from Henry VIII's privy purse. The Spanish jester Borra left an estate including gold plate, Arabian horses, and, in a final dark joke, the very whip his master had occasionally used on him. Yet these accumulations meant little when true power shifted. A deposed king's favorite fool often found himself stripped of assets by the new regime, his wealth proving as mutable as his jokes. Payment often came in forms more valuable than coin. The right to dine at court saved the cost of meals. Cast-off clothing from nobles provided material for future costumes. Permission to travel freely between kingdoms allowed some jesters to run lucrative side businesses in information brokerage. One enterprising fool in the Habsburg court supplemented his income by smuggling rare spices in his oversized sleeves, declaring them seasoning for dull wits when questioned. The social compensation proved more complex than the financial. A talented jester might eat from gold plate one evening and be beaten for insolence the next morning. His access to the monarch granted influence most courtiers envied, yet his official status hovered somewhere between pet and furniture. The Earl of Oxford's accounts list his fool between the kennel master and the choir director. Not quite servant, not quite gentleman. This ambiguous position meant that while a fool might sleep on down pillows, he still entered rooms through back passages. Some jesters turned their financial acumen into survival strategies. The Burgundian fool Collinet invested his earnings in a vineyard, ensuring income should his tongue outlast royal favor. Others, like Mathurin de Valois, lent money to nobles at interest, securing both profit and protection. Few lords would execute a creditor holding their IOUs. The wisest fools understood their wealth's primary purpose wasn't comfort, but leverage. A well-placed bribe to the right guard could mean the difference between exile and execution when fortunes turned. Yet history shows even the richest fools ultimately depended on caprice. When Cardinal Richelieu took offense at the Jester L'Hôpital's stinging critiques of church corruption, no amount of accumulated wealth prevented the man's imprisonment. When James's favorite fool, Archie Armstrong, grew too bold in mocking royal favorites, his substantial properties couldn't save him from banishment. The lesson echoed through every court. Gold might gild the cage, but the lock still opened at the king's command. Perhaps the cruelest economic truth was that a jester's value depreciated with age. Young fools could tumble and sing. Old ones risked becoming sad reminders of bygone merriment. Pension systems existed in theory, but rarely in practice. The fate of most jesters after their prime resembled that of the Holy Roman Emperor's fool, Kunz von der Rosen, granted a cottage in his declining years, but visited only when nostalgia demanded, his once sharp wit now tolerated like the dribblings of a senile grandfather. In the end, the economics of jesting revealed an uncomfortable truth about court life itself. Everything had a price, but nothing had guaranteed value. A fool might be paid like a prince today, and discarded like rubbish tomorrow. His gold buying neither safety nor respect, only temporary reprieve from the razor's edge on which he danced. The coins piled up, the properties multiplied, the fine silks accumulated, and none of it changed the fundamental calculus that the jester's life, for all its glitter, remained a high-wire act without a net. Chapter 8. The executioner's favorite audience. The court jester's bells made a particular sound when their wearer was dragged to the scaffold, a desperate, discordant jangling that marked the final punchline of a career spent dancing on the edge of a blade. For every jester who retired to a comfortable farm, a dozen more met ends that would have been comedy, had they not been in tragedy. The executioner knew them well, these purveyors of mirth who ultimately provided one last service to their patrons, a cautionary demonstration of what happened when laughter curdled into something darker. Some rulers developed reputations for collecting jester executions, like other monarchs collected rare books. Ivan the Terrible's court saw at least 7 jesters executed during his reign, their offenses ranging from mocking his failed military campaigns to joking about the size of his wine cellar during a famine. The Tsar had a particular fondness for creative punishments. One fool found himself sealed inside a giant iron roaster and slowly baked to death after suggesting Ivan's new fur coat made him resemble a bear in both appearance and temperament. The executioner's log noted the jest had greatly amused His Majesty until it did not. The French court proved especially treacherous for truth-tellers. Louis de Lace, despite his reputation for keeping clever fools, ordered the hanging of his jester Treason after one barb too many about the king's worsening paranoia. Witnesses reported Treason maintained his wit to the end, telling the hangman, "At least now I'll finally get ahead in life." The joke earned him a swift drop and an unmarked grave. England's Henry VIII predictably turned jester executions into a spectator sport. His fool was Somers once watched in horror as his colleague Sexton was beheaded for calling Anne Boleyn the king's greatest folly. The headsman reported Somers whispering to the severed head, "Now who's the fool?" a quip that likely saved his own neck through its perfect mix of horror and humor. Tudor justice appreciated wit, even in its victims. The execution records reveal morbid patterns in royal vengeance. Jesters who mocked military failures tended to die quicker, but more mercifully than those who commented on royal virility or reproductive struggles. A Spanish fool, who joked about Philip IV's inability to produce healthy heirs, spent 3 years in an iron cage before being accidentally crushed by a loose palace gargoyle. Conversely, a German jester who ridiculed his lord's disastrous cavalry charge merely had his tongue nailed to the castle gates, a punishment both poetic and, with prompt medical attention, survivable. Some executions became legendary for their irony. In 1527, the Duke of Ferrara's jester was convicted of treason after joking the Duke ruled like a man who expects to die tomorrow. The punchline came when the executioner's sword broke during the beheading, requiring 3 agonizing blows, proving the fool's assessment of the duchy's shoddy equipment painfully accurate. The incident so amused neighboring rulers that 2 other jesters were reportedly executed within the month for retelling the story. The gallows humor extended to the executioners themselves. Medieval Paris's chief headsman Pierrepoint kept a ledger noting which condemned jesters managed final witticisms. His personal favorite belonged to one Guillaume, who upon seeing the rusty state of the executioner's axe, quipped, "Do you intend to kill me or simply annoy me to death?" Pierrepoint's notation reads, "Client maintained excellent comic timing throughout proceedings. Tip to sous-soir." Not all doomed jesters went quietly. Records from Prague Castle tell of a fool named Jan who turned his own hanging into a biting satire, arranging for hired actors in the crowd to weep dramatically while shouting, "He died as he lived, making nobles look foolish." The stunt so enraged Emperor Rudolph that he ordered Jan's corpse left swinging for a month, during which time the decaying body became an unofficial tourist attraction, proving the jester had the last laugh after all. The frequency of jester executions followed predictable cycles. Wars and plagues saw fewer fools killed. Rulers apparently recognized the need for comic relief during hard times. Periods of peace and prosperity, however, proved deadly, as bored monarchs grew impatient with satire. The Italian city-states were particularly ruthless during their Renaissance heyday. Venice's Doge Dandolo executed 4 jesters in as many years, each for increasingly trivial offenses. The last allegedly died for sighing too dramatically during a particularly dull state dinner. What makes these executions particularly chilling is how many were technically legal. Most European legal codes contained vague provisions against scandalum magnatum, the offense of mocking rulers. English common law explicitly exempted fools from this charge, but clever prosecutors found ways around it. When Henry Vives' jester Roland was charged with treason in 1415, the court ruled his motley costume constituted a disguise for seditious purposes rather than professional attire. The verdict took 15 minutes. Perhaps the darkest joke of all was how many doomed jesters saw their ends coming. The diary of one French fool contains an entry written the night before his execution. "Tomorrow I perform my greatest trick, vanishing from this world to thunderous applause." His final request was that his bells be polished bright for the occasion. The executioner's report notes they shone beautifully in the morning sun as the blade fell, their cheerful jangling abruptly silenced mid-chime. In the end, the executioner's block became the ultimate audience for these purveyors of mirth. A silent, implacable critic that never failed to get the last word. The wise ones knew no amount of wit could save a jester whose time had come. Their only consolation was that in kingdoms where laughter died first, they wouldn't be the last to follow. Chapter 9. The Jester's Last Laugh. Famous final words. Death was the one audience that never heckled, the one critic that couldn't be won over with a well-timed pratfall or clever turn of phrase. Yet the best jesters understood their final moment as the ultimate performance, a chance to deliver the punchline that would echo through history long after their bells had fallen silent. Some chose defiance, others absurdity, a few heartbreaking honesty. But nearly all recognized that last words, like jokes, depended entirely on delivery. The Spanish jester Borra, facing the gallows for calling King Philip II the dullest monarch in Christendom, reportedly turned to his executioner and said, "Do pull my leg when it's over. It's the only joke His Majesty will ever understand." The crowd's laughter so unsettled the attending priests that they hurried the execution long before Borra could continue. His corpse was said to have worn a grin that lingered for hours, as if even death couldn't wipe away his final jest. Not all parting quips landed so well. When the Florentine fool, Pietro, was sentenced to burning for mocking Lorenzo de' Medici's poetry, his attempt at gallows humor, "At least my jokes never killed anyone," earned him an extra bundle of kindling. Eyewitnesses noted the smoke carried the scent of roasting pork for hours. Afterward, a detail Pietro might have appreciated had he not been its source. Some final words revealed unexpected depth. The English jester Dick Tarleton, beloved of Queen Elizabeth until one joke too many about her fading looks, knelt before the headsman and murmured, "Strike true, friend, for my neck's the only thing about me that's never been false." The Queen, upon hearing this, reportedly ordered a stay of execution, which arrived precisely 3 minutes too late. Tarleton's head, when retrieved from the basket, appeared to maintain its characteristic wry smile. The French court witnessed perhaps the most poetic exit when the jester Brusquet, condemned for calling Henry II a man who couldn't satisfy a wife in bed or an enemy on the battlefield, was granted a final request. He asked for and received a looking-glass. Staring at his reflection as the noose was fitted, he sighed, "At last, a ruler who'll follow my every move." The executioner's journal notes this earned an extra half-turn of the rope to ensure proper appreciation of the wit. Records from the Holy Roman Empire tell of a nameless fool who, when offered blindfold before his beheading, replied, "Why bother? I've spent my life pretending not to see the obvious." The executioner, either deeply moved or profoundly irritated, took his head in a single clean stroke, unusual for the notoriously clumsy imperial headsman. Some last words became legends through sheer audacity. The Russian jester Balakirev, moments before being impaled on Ivan the Terrible's orders, shouted, "Careful with that stake! It's the only straight thing in this entire country!" The Tsar, according to court chronicles, laughed so hard he spilled his wine, then ordered Balakirev's family killed anyway. The dying quips weren't always verbal. The Italian mime Janelli, sentenced to hang for his silent parody of Pope Alexander VI's corruption, performed his entire act on the scaffold, culminating with an exaggerated shrug as the trapdoor opened. Witnesses claimed his limp body continued the routine as it swung, twitching in perfect pantomime of papal benedictions. Occasionally, the humor came from circumstances rather than the condemned. When the Danish jester Claus was beheaded for mocking Christian IV's drinking, his severed head supposedly bounced to land upright facing the royal box, its dead lips parted in what observers swore was a knowing smirk. The king, thoroughly unnerved, banned all performances of Hamlet's graveyard scene for the remainder of his reign. Some jesters weaponized their final moments. The Polish fool Stańczyk, facing execution for predicting his king's military defeat, turned his scaffold speech into such a devastating critique of royal incompetence that 3 officers in the audience resigned their commissions on the spot. His famous last words, "I die not for my lies, but for my truths," became a rallying cry for reformers and earned him the unique distinction of having his corpse tried posthumously for sedition. The annals of the Spanish Inquisition contain perhaps the bleakest example. The converted Jewish jester Solomon, burned at the stake for heretical humor, was offered clemency if he'd convert back to Christianity. His response, "Why? Does your God have better jokes?" earned him extra oil on the pyre. Onlookers noted his final screams formed a bizarrely rhythmic pattern that some swore was laughter. Not all last words were witty. Some cut to the heart of the jester's plight. When the aging fool Jacques was sentenced to death by Louis XIV for simply no longer being amusing, His final whisper to the executioner was, "Tell me when it's over." The Sun King, upon hearing this, allegedly paused for a full minute before waving the execution forward. The closest thing to mercy he ever showed a jester. Perhaps the most haunting final words come from an unnamed English fool during the Wars of the Roses. As the executioner fumbled with a dull axe, the jester murmured, "At least let me die better than I lived, with one clean stroke." When the headsman finally obliged on the third attempt, spectators claimed the severed lips continued moving for several seconds, as if determined to get in one last jest. The truth about these famous last words, of course, is that most were likely embellished by later chroniclers. But that seems fitting for a profession built on embellishment. What matters isn't their veracity, but that we still repeat them centuries later. Proof that in the end, the jesters did have the last laugh. Their words outlived their executioners, their monarchs, even the kingdoms that condemned them. And that may be the greatest punchline of all. Chapter 10. The Decline of the Fool. When laughter went out of fashion. The extinction of the professional court jester came not with a bang, but with a slow, bewildered sigh. A gradual realization that monarchs no longer needed someone to tell them the truth, not even in jest. As crowns became symbols of constitutional authority rather than divine right, as courts transformed into bureaucratic machines rather than personal fiefdoms, the fool found himself increasingly out of place, his motley looking less like a uniform and more like a costume from a bygone era. The decline began with the most dangerous development of all, politeness. The Enlightenment's obsession with rationality and decorum left little room for the chaotic, subversive energy of the traditional fool. Where Renaissance princes had tolerated, even encouraged, their jesters biting satire, the rulers of the 18th century preferred their critiques delivered through pamphlets and philosophical treatises, where they could be ignored rather than laughed at. Frederick the Great of Prussia kept a fool named Puss in Boots for old time's sake, but winced visibly whenever the man actually attempted humor, preferring instead the company of poets who praised his military genius without irony. Changing political realities also played their part. The rise of parliamentary systems meant kings no longer stood alone as solitary targets for satire. Power became diffuse, faceless, and consequently far less amusing to mock. A jester could skewer Henry VIII's marital troubles with a well-timed quip about changing bedsheets, but how does one joke about a committee? The English court's last official fool, a melancholy man named Muckle John, spent his final years wandering Hampton Court muttering, "Where's the fun in mocking a minister?" before being quietly pensioned off in 1745. Even the fashion of humor changed. The medieval fool's physical slapstick and bawdy wordplay gave way to wit of a more refined variety, precisely the sort of humor that didn't require a man in bells. The French court's transition was particularly telling. Louis XIV still maintained a sizable troupe of fools, but by Louis VI's reign, the position had devolved into a ceremonial role filled by second-rate actors who performed sanitized versions of their predecessors' routines. When one of these pale imitations dared joke about Marie Antoinette's hair during the bread shortages, he wasn't executed, merely fired, a fate somehow more humiliating than the scaffold. The few jesters who adapted to changing times found themselves trapped in a peculiar limbo. The German jester Fröhlich, employed by the progressive Duke Karl August of Weimar, attempted to modernize by studying philosophy and incorporating references to Kant into his act. The experiment ended when the Duke gently informed him, "My dear Fröhlich, when I want profundity, I summon Goethe. When I want a fool, I want a fool." Within months, the position was abolished entirely, replaced by a small stipend for poets who would at least flatter intelligently. The Industrial Revolution delivered the final blow. Monarchs became figureheads, courts became museums, and the ancient tradition of the licensed truth-teller withered into quaint nostalgia. Queen Victoria, when presented with a petition to revive the position for the amusement of the royal children, reportedly replied, "We are not amused," 3 words that might serve as the perfect epitaph for the entire profession. Yet something vital was lost in this transition. The fool had served a purpose deeper than entertainment. He was the court's collective ID, the one voice permitted to say what others merely thought. Without him, power became more polished, but less accountable, more dignified, but far less human. The last true jester in Europe, a broken-down comedian, kept on at the Austro-Hungarian court purely as a living antique. Perhaps put it best when he told the young Franz Joseph, "Your Majesty will never have a servant as honest as I am. And you'll never miss him until he's gone." The emperor, not understanding, gave the man a gold watch and sent him away. Within a year, the position had been abolished entirely, replaced by a gramophone. The professional fool's extinction mirrored broader societal shifts: the loss of sanctioned transgression, the death of ritualized mockery, the rise of a world where power no longer tolerated being laughed at directly. Modern politicians still face satire, of course, but it comes from distant television screens and anonymous Twitter accounts, never from a man standing 3 feet away with bells on his shoes and nothing left to lose. We gained civility but lost something far more precious: the ability of those in power to laugh at themselves, and the safety valve that comes when they're given no choice. Perhaps the real joke is that we ever thought we could do without fools. Their absence leaves a silence no amount of polite applause can fill, the sound of power unchecked by laughter, of rulers no longer reminded they're human. The jesters may be gone, but their lesson remains. Every court, every government, every seat of power needs someone who can look the king in the eye and tell him he's wearing no clothes. Especially if he really isn't. Chapter 11. Modern Fools. The legacy of the court jester. The court jester never truly disappeared. He simply traded his motley for a suit, his bells for a microphone, and his royal patrons for television executives. Today's comedians, satirists, and social commentators walk the same tightrope their medieval predecessors once did, balancing truth and entertainment, critique and survival, though the stakes have shifted from the executioner's axe to the cancel culture mob. The tools have changed, but the game remains eerily familiar. Speak truth to power. Make them laugh while doing it, and hope you last longer than the last guy who tried. Consider the late-night talk show host, that modern incarnation of the royal fool. Like jesters of old, they deliver their barbs under the protective cloak of entertainment, cushioned by studio laughter, and the unspoken agreement that it's all in good fun. A comedian can call a president incompetent in a way no news anchor ever could, provided he follows it with a smirk and a pause for applause. The parallels run deep. Where Traboulet mocked King Francis's military failures, Stephen Colbert skewered presidential missteps. Both operated on the same principle: wrap the bitter pill in honey, and maybe the king will swallow it without noticing. Yet today's jesters face the same precarious existence as their ancestors. Just as medieval fools could be cast out for one joke too many about royal mistresses, modern comedians find themselves exiled from platforms for crossing invisible lines. The mechanisms of punishment have evolved. No one gets beheaded over a Netflix special, but the underlying dynamic remains. A jester's safety still depends entirely on the mood of those in power, whether they wear crowns or corporate logos. Satire news programs like Key Daily Show and Last Week Tonight function as the closest equivalent to the court jester's privileged position. Their hosts enjoy a license to critique that would get a journalist fired, echoing the ancient tradition that allowed fools to say what others couldn't. John Oliver's exhaustive takedowns of corporate malfeasance follow the same pattern as Will Sommer's veiled criticisms of Henry VIII's tax policies, presented as entertainment but carrying real political weight. The major difference? Modern satirists need Nielsen ratings more than royal favor, though both ultimately answer to those who sign their paychecks. Stand-up comedians occupy a space similar to the traveling jesters of old, moving from club to club like market square entertainers, testing material on different crowds. The best, like Dave Chappelle or George Carlin, take on the fool's traditional role as truth-teller, Using humor to expose societal hypocrisy is too uncomfortable for polite conversation. Their stages have replaced the castle courtyards, their specials stand in for royal command performances, but the dynamic remains unchanged. Laughter is both weapon and shield. The internet has democratized the fool's role beyond recognition. Where once a kingdom might support one or two professional jesters, now thousands of meme creators, YouTubers, and Twitter satirists perform similar functions with exponentially greater reach. The court has become global, the kings replaced by politicians, celebrities, and tech billionaires, all begging to be mocked. A medieval jester needed years to hone his craft before daring to insult a monarch. Today, a teenager with Photoshop can humiliate a world leader before breakfast. Yet something fundamental has been lost in this transition. The professional court jester enjoyed something no modern comedian possesses: official sanction. His role came with recognized, if precarious, privileges, the right to speak when others would be silenced, the protection, however thin, of tradition. Today's truth-tellers operate without such safeguards, vulnerable not just to offended power brokers, but to outraged mobs on all sides. The result is a paradox. Never have more people played the fool's role, yet never has that role been more dangerous. Political cartoonists might be the purest inheritors of the jester's mantle, distilling complex critiques into single, devastating images, just as medieval fools reduced truths to barbed one-liners. Like their ancestors, they frequently pay the price. Where fools faced execution, cartoonists face lawsuits, death threats, and in some countries, imprisonment. The French magazine Charlie Hebdo learned this brutally in 2015, when staff were murdered for cartoons mocking religious extremism, proving that some powers still respond to satire as medieval kings once did, with lethal force. Even the ancient tension between jesters and religious authority persists. Medieval fools risked death mocking corrupt clergy. Today's comedians face boycotts and backlash for tackling religious hypocrisy. The mechanisms have changed. Nobody gets burned at the stake over a blasphemy joke anymore. But the underlying conflict between humor and dogma remains eternal. Perhaps the most telling parallel lies in how modern powers attempt to co-opt their jesters. Kings once kept fools as living proof of their tolerance for criticism. Today, corporations sponsor satirical shows to demonstrate their commitment to free expression, right up until that expression threatens the bottom line. The dynamic remains as old as the first court jester, allowed just enough dissent to appear magnanimous, but never enough to actually challenge authority. Yet for all these similarities, today's truth-tellers lack one crucial advantage their predecessors enjoyed: plausible deniability. When a medieval fool went too far, he could always claim it was just a joke, his costume and bells serving as built-in excuses. Modern comedians, operating without such obvious artifice, find their words scrutinized for subtext and intent. A tweet can be analyzed frame by frame, a stand-up routine dissected for hidden meanings. The fool's motley, it turns out, was more protective than it appeared. The legacy of the court jester lives on wherever humor serves as both entertainment and social critique. From Onion headlines to TikTok skits lampooning politicians, the ancient tradition continues in endlessly adapted forms. What hasn't changed is the fundamental calculus. Make them laugh while making them think, and pray the former outweighs the latter. The executioner may have traded his axe for a cancellation campaign, but the dance remains the same, truth wrapped in laughter, delivered on a knife's edge. In the end, perhaps the greatest testament to the jester's enduring relevance is how desperately every authoritarian regime still seeks to silence them. Tyrants who crush free press, ban opposition parties, and rewrite history books still fear the comedian's microphone above all. They understand what kings always have, that laughter can undermine power faster than any revolution. The court jester may be gone, but his spirit survives wherever someone risks a joke at the powerful's expense. And for that small, subversive act, the tradition remains immortal. Chapter 12. The Fool's Grave. Unmarked and unmourned. The earth contains no grand monuments to jesters. No marble effigies lie with folded hands in cathedral naves. No gilded epitaphs proclaim their wit for eternity. Most rest in forgotten corners of churchyards, their graves long since swallowed by grass and ivy, their bones mingled with paupers and criminals in unmarked pits. This seems fitting for men and women who lived on the margins, honored in life when they amused, discarded in death when they ceased to be entertaining. Historians estimate thousands of professional fools entertained European courts across 6 centuries. We know the names of perhaps 200. The rest vanished as completely as their laughter, leaving only fragmentary records in account books. An entry for a pair of shoes here, a payment for wine there, before disappearing into the silence. Even famous jesters typically met obscure ends. Triboulet, who mocked kings and survived, lies somewhere beneath the streets of modern Paris, his exact resting place paved over by progress. Will Sommers, Henriette VIII's beloved fool, was buried in an unmarked plot in London's St. Leonard's Church, the site now occupied by a bland office building. Only a small plaque, placed centuries later by sentimental historians, hints that the man who once made a tyrant laugh ever existed at all. The physical erasure mirrors the historical one. Jesters rarely wrote their own stories, and chroniclers seldom bothered recording them unless they died spectacularly. We know more about the execution methods of famous fools than about their daily lives. Their voices survive only in second-hand anecdotes filtered through scribes who often missed the point. Imagine how much richer history might be if we had Triboulet's memoirs or Jane Foole's diary, but then who would have thought to preserve them? Archaeology offers little help. Jesters were typically buried without their iconic costumes or bells, those being property of the court to be passed to the next fool, leaving no distinctive grave goods to identify them. In 2013, excavators at Greenwich Palace uncovered a skeleton with deformed legs that might have belonged to a court dwarf jester. But with no records matching the burial, the man's identity and jokes died with him. He remains anonymous, his very deformities now just another museum exhibit. The few extant jester graves tell poignant stories. In Germany's St. Peter's Abbey, a single fool named Kunz von der Rosenrates a modest stone, but only because his master, Emperor Maximilian I, happened to die before him. The inscription reads simply "the Emperor's shadow," a backhanded compliment suggesting even in death, the fool couldn't escape his supporting role. In Prague, a crumbling marker for an unknown jester bears weather-worn carvings of bells and a staff, the medieval equivalent of a comedian's microphone, etched in stone. No dates, no name, just the faint suggestion that someone once made a king chuckle. Some graves became ironic punchlines. The Spanish jester Borra, who amassed considerable wealth through royal favor, spent lavishly on a marble tomb proclaiming his virtues. When the Inquisition posthumously convicted him of heresy, they smashed the monument and scattered the pieces. Today, goats graze where his bones mouldered, occasionally stumbling over a chunk of carved marble that once boasted of his wit. The most haunting aspect isn't the missing graves, but the missing stories. Each unmarked patch of earth represents hundreds of jokes lost, satires forgotten, truths told that no one bothered to remember. The medieval court must have echoed with laughter daily, yet we've preserved barely a fraction of the wit that filled those halls. What brilliant observations died with the fools who spoke them? What truths about kings and queens went to the grave, because no chronicler considered jesters worth recording? Perhaps this erasure was intentional. The powerful have always had reasons to forget their critics, even the licensed ones. By letting fools vanish into oblivion, rulers ensured their jokes wouldn't linger as long as their policies. Shakespeare understood this when he had Hamlet muse over Yorick's skull, The prince remembers the jester's antics, but only in vague, sentimental terms. The substance of Yorick's wit is already gone, his most cutting barks against injustice lost to time. Yet in their anonymity, the forgotten jesters achieved a kind of victory. Their unmarked graves serve as the ultimate satire on power, proof that all earthly glory fades, that kings and fools alike return to dust. The difference is that the kings expected monuments, while the fools knew better. Their silence now is the last laugh, a reminder that the mighty build tombs to be desecrated, while the wise leave nothing to ruin. As dusk falls over the churchyard where Will Summers supposedly lies, office workers hurry past his plaque without glancing down. Somewhere beneath their feet, perhaps, the bones of a man who dared make a murderer laugh turn slowly to earth. There's poetry in that, the ultimate court jester's joke, played on eternity itself. The kings built pyramids and sarcophagi, desperate to be remembered. The fool, who understood the vanity of it all, rests content in oblivion, his final punchline being that he needed no epitaph at all. The grass grows over all of them equally.